doing?
I'm okay. Can you hear me?
We got
Yep.
you, yeah.
Okay. Phew.
Glad to have you. Thank you.
Oh my goodness. So I live in Seattle and I can't believe, we should have perfect internet connection, and I just can't even imagine what it must be like to be out on the peninsula where I know the connections are not great. And then, all the challenges that I've had, yours must be tripled. So with that, thank you for having me to come speak today. My name is Yvonne deReynier, and I work for the National Marine Fisheries Service and have for 20 plus years. And I began by working on groundfish and halibut fisheries management, and I've done some work on marine spatial planning and ecosystem-based management, and work on climate change mitigation planning. So a lot of policy stuff. But my experience is with federal marine waters, and so not as near shore as all of you, but I'm happy to share some ideas. And Doug asked me to talk a little bit about some of the philosophical ideas behind ecosystem-based management. It sounds though like you guys are already in the mode of thinking of projects that sort of have a win-win-win scenario. And a little later on in the talk, I'm going to ask you some questions. So what I'd like to do is see if you can, let's see, introduce yourselves and your MRCs in the chat box. And then I'd like to see if I can actually see the chat box. No, I can't. Okay. So Jackson, are you seeing folks chatting in the chat box?
Yep, we just had Key just put her name and Pacific in there. You see that?
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So if other folks could, all right. Thank you, Tom. Good. All right. Let's get underway then. Let's see. So as I mentioned, Doug had sort of asked me to talk about some of the philosophies behind ecosystem-based management. And you guys are doing quite a lot of this big picture work already. I was totally impressed with the projects that I heard about on Thursday. So that was really, it was really exciting for me to listen to, and very much impressed with your work. So at any rate, when we think about ecosystems, what we often think about is sort of these big picture images, at least I do, like of a whole watershed or a forest or a desert. And but sometimes people think about more of a food web diagram, sort of what are all the organisms and how do they interact with each other, primarily by consuming each other, and who are the top predators and who are the lowest trophic level species. But since humans are themselves living organisms, and we have so many different activities, we are part of the ecosystem, obviously, and we interact with the ecosystem. And so, there are a lot of people in more urban areas who tend to think of themselves as, not part of the natural world. And so part of ecosystem-based management is getting people to understand that humans are organisms, and we interact with the ecosystem in a lot of different ways. And the ways that we interact with the ecosystem affect it and are affected by it. So historically in the United States, while there have always been individuals or families or cultures known for hunting or fishing or farming in ways that better take into account the needs of other organisms and of the physical environment, the dominant ideas driving US policy and the economy up through the 1950s were really imagining our natural resources as limitless, and that any harm that we might do to the environment is sort of a necessary byproduct of the nation's forward progress. By the 1960s, however, more Americans were starting to wonder, had we gone too far? And more than that, our regular everyday citizens, do we have rights to things like drinkable water and breathable air? And it seems crazy now, but that was really a question. And, oh dear, why is that not showing? Ah, there we go. So it was it's sort of unbelievable to me now to think about this, but the major environmental laws in this country were put into place in the late 1960s through the early 1980s. And I don't know if you can see this or if you're seeing the chat box on my screen, but I have the names of the applicable presidents for that period, and I put those in because I don't think that they're necessarily known for being, you know, sort of strong environmental thinkers, but they were, and there was quite a lot of work done between the president and the Congress to, you know, think big picture about what, you know, what are our different parts of the ecosystem, how do they interact with each other, and how do we ensure that we have natural resources available for the long term. Okay. So in the US, our thinking about ecosystem-based management and the place of humans within the ecosystem grew out of a lot of turmoil and questioning about the roles of national and state forests. So are trees crops? And if so, are our national forests parts of those croplands, or are they part of the natural ecosystems that we can use, but perhaps need to do so with an eye towards what other organisms need or how the ecosystems function rather than just more efficient harvest? Or is there some combination of both? And, you know, no matter whether those trees or crops are part of ecosystems or both, you know, rethinking forest management policies has been particularly urgent in recent decades. And for us as Washingtonians, you know, pretty bad summer that we've been having lately. So in Forest Service history, or maybe even lore, it was a pair of folks from Arkansas, Senator David Pryor and Forest Service Chief Dale Robertson, a conversation that they had at the Ouachita National Forest in 1992 that led that agency to call for the end to clear cutting and to the adoption of a new policy on an ecological approach, which their language later emerged as ecosystem management. So you can see, in trying to figure out what the ecological approach meant, they were weighing these ideas that we could use natural resources without using them up, and that maybe there were less tangible benefits to humans, benefits that we now call ecosystem services, like clean air and clean water, things that we could have from healthy ecosystems that, that we needed from healthy ecosystems, and that there were some problems with our historic policies of just, you know, sort of rushing ahead without thinking about the consequences of our work. So my own agency, the National Marine Fisheries Service, doesn't have any apocryphal stories like a walk in the woods between two, you know, big cheeses. But we have been thinking about ecosystem-based management or ecosystem approaches to management, at least since the 1980s. And we joined with the Forest Service and other agencies in the mid-90s as the concept of ecosystem management took off across the government agencies and academia. It was not about managing whole ecosystems, of course, but it was about managing human activities within ecosystems and understanding the connections between different species, including humans in the ecosystem, and the connections between the species and the physical environment. So the document on the left is a federal interagency agreement to work together to implement an ecosystem approach to natural resource management. And yes, it is totally bureaucratic, but it does have some ideas and definitions that you can think about and sort of break down to see how they might help you define ecosystem-based management for your resources. So goal-driven, thinking about restoration of the health and productivity, but also, integrated with social and economic goals. So integrate human use with the restoration of some of the ecosystem services that we enjoy. Now, the publication on the right, that 1994 paper was, the author is Grumbine, and it, to me, really breaks down ecosystem-based management in a way that I find clear and understandable. It sort of has these 5 principles, and they link up nicely to those groundbreaking laws I had mentioned that came out of the 1970s. So in exploring ecosystem-based management, we're essentially asking ourselves, how do we maintain native populations and habitats and processes over time? And by that, we mean that we have to think ahead of our own generation, beyond that, multiple generations in human lifetimes, but also multiple generations of the species that we manage. And within all that, accommodate human uses. So this is a very different way of thinking about natural resource management than the ways that we had been thinking in prior decades. Although, given the last talk, clearly the science that has led up to the change in the laws has been going on for many decades. So in the chat box, if you would, I wanted to ask you about one of those first principles of ecosystem-based management. Are there native species within your MRC area that are at population levels that are concerning to you? And so I would include, if you're particularly concerned with things that are labeled as endangered or threatened, go ahead and write those down. But many people have species that they care about or they're concerned about that are not necessarily listed as threatened and endangered. And then what you also note is habitat loss a contributing factor to your species decline? And if you have any thoughts on what's causing that habitat loss. And then Jackson, if you could let me know if the chat is working on that, that would be great.
Yep, we've got some chats coming in there. Yeah.
So what are some of the species that people are mentioning?
Okay, cool. I can read them out to you as they go. Does that sound good?
That sounds great. Thank you. That would be helpful.
Yeah. First one we have is marbled murrelet, and habitat loss is a key component of that. And we have burrowing shrimp have expanded spatially and population-wise and are destroying shellfish beds and other habitat. Yeah, so that's a native species, which is, I guess, the population levels are concerning because they're blooming rather than declining. So. And then we have sea lion population growth depressing salmon populations. And songbirds, the export of outlawed chemicals is affecting them. And I'll add one to that connects to the burrowing shrimp. I'd say aquatic predators of burrowing shrimp, such as salmon and sturgeon.
Right.
Yeah, and that's economically too.
Great. Okay. Then I will go down. Let's see. And did I? Okay, thank you. So when I started thinking about this talk, I was, and this was, a couple of weeks ago, I was thinking about, okay, how do I create some real world example or metaphor from everyday life about, how to think ahead into the future. And I was, at that time, had not heard your Thursday talks, and so was unaware of everything you've already been doing to sort of combine this, you know, multiple benefits types of projects. But if you've ever had a job where you have to get up so early in the morning to get to work that you know you're not going to get out the door unless you put everything that you need, you know, at the door the night before, then you already have the, I think, the ability to think ahead enough to think about ecosystem-based management. And then, you know, a more fun example might be like you're going on a backpacking trip and you have to think about what all do I have to bring to make sure that I'm safe and fed and, yeah, you know, able to get through the trip successfully. Or, you know, sort of an even more detailed way of thinking. The fellow on the right-hand side of the screen is a galley chef for a NOAA research ship. And, you know, we can go out for weeks or months at a time. And you can see in the background there, he's got these giant jars of spices. Well, imagine like the grocery trips that he has to do before they go on the cruise, and all the different people he has to think about, and the food he has to buy, and you know, how long is the food going to last? And so things like that, you know, if you've ever done anything that's got some kind of planning ahead, and you know, on multiple different levels, you're ready for ecosystem-based management. So in fisheries management in particular, when we really got down to thinking ahead, and when Congress decided to give us some guidance for that logistical style of thinking for management, they came up with some broad parameters to help us get to that long term and help us think over the long term. And so first, we maintain native species by prohibiting overfishing and requiring overfished stocks to be rebuilt. Second, we are required to identify essential fish habitat, protect that habitat from the effects of fishing gear, and also we're not empowered to protect it entirely from the effects of non-fishing activities, but we do have some influence over non-fishing activities and their effects on habitat. And for those of you, this picture may look a little odd. Those are squid eggs, and I'm sure some of you have seen those or seen photos of those since they're lolligo squid, they're market squid that come all the way up to BC. Another arm of our authority includes minimizing bycatch. And so this is a bycatch reduction device, a type of device that allows the more vulnerable species to escape while keeping the species that we actually want to target. And then also with all of that, to think about the effects of our actions on fishing communities. And we have not just the Magnuson-Stevens Act, but the Regulatory Flexibility Act that require us to really give a deep think to the effects of our actions on small businesses, and whether there are ways that we can tweak our actions so that they are so they have less of a burden on small businesses. Bearing in mind, of course, that many of the small businesses that we regulate are benefiting directly from harvesting a public resource. So, what are some of the more so through all of that, some of the more regional resources for you in thinking about ecosystem-based management in coastal Washington? Thinking about that, oops, did I go backwards too soon? Oh. Thinking about that led me to look for some of the different papers and documents that you may be familiar with. NOAA has worked on condition reports for all of the West Coast sanctuaries, and then you are probably more familiar with the document on the lower left, Ecological Indicators for Washington State's Outer Coastal Waters. I hope that somebody came to speak with the MRCs about that, or at least consulted with you on that. And then nationally, in my agency, we have been required to put together regional implementation plans for ecosystem-based management. And you'll see there on the right that we just finished that last year. And when it's the Western region is all of the US West Coast, Washington down to Oregon. So when I was looking for more Washington examples, of course, I found this State of the Washington Coast document, and you probably are familiar with that. Came out in 2011, and then I was thinking, oh, I wonder if there's something more recent, and you know about that because I heard somebody mention it the other day, the Marine Spatial Plan. So actually, your Marine Spatial Plan, I think, is pretty useful for helping you to think about ecosystem-based management. It has a lot of questions for you that you can use to think about the sort of projects that you might want to work on. And given that, and given your Marine Spatial Plan, what are some of